I'm Margaret Lewis, 67 years old, and after decades of building a career where precision meant safety, I thought I understood the rules that kept people honest. But on a quiet Thursday morning, while Olivia's voice carried from the next room, I heard her tell someone that their Maldives resort and business class flights were already paid for. Her laugh followed light and unhurried as she added that I wouldn't mind. An hour later, my emergency account showed a balance of negative $44,000. I sat in my kitchen, holding an old bone china teacup my late husband once gave me, staring at the numbers as if they belonged to someone else. That was the moment I realized the people I loved most had crossed a line I could not ignore. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to protect what you worked a lifetime to build. I was born and raised in Spokane, the youngest of three in a family where both parents worked, my mother as a school librarian, my father as a mail carrier. We didn't have much, but every dollar was stretched with care, every promise kept. I carried those values into my career, joining the Federal Aviation Administration fresh out of college, where schedules were sacred and even the smallest oversight could cost lives. For more than 30 years, my work revolved around checklists, protocols, and a belief that trust was something you earned over time, never taken for granted. After Robert passed away 8 years ago, my life shifted into a quieter rhythm. I moved to an apartment just outside Seattle, close enough to watch the runways at SeaTac from my kitchen window. The sight of departing jets steadied me. Their order and predictability felt like an anchor. Daniel, my only child, had settled nearby with Olivia. They visited often enough, sometimes staying for days when work or travel kept them in the area. I welcomed it, believing it kept us close, believing proximity meant connection. Olivia built a large following online for her wellness brand, carefully arranged breakfast photos, sunlit yoga poses, and captioned affirmations. It was a world far removed from my own, where a well-balanced spreadsheet was more satisfying than a perfect photograph. Still, I like to think we were learning from each other. I brought the grounding of discipline, she brought the reminder to slow down. Or so I told myself. The truth was, their lifestyle had edges I didn't fully understand. Sponsorships, brand deals, trips that blurred the line between work and leisure. That Thursday began like any other. 2 scoops of coffee into the filter kettle set to 198 degrees, the soft hum of traffic outside. I had a short list of errands, restocking pantry staples, checking in on emails for the women's safety group I co-ran. It wasn't until I heard Olivia's voice float in from the living room light with excitement that the day shifted. She was on speakerphone telling someone their 5-day resort stay and business flights were already covered, adding that with my history in aviation, I wouldn't mind at all. It was meant as a joke. But something in the way she said it, a tone too easy, too certain, stuck in my chest. When they left for a photo shoot that afternoon, their laughter still lingering in the hallway, I opened my laptop. What I saw made the room tilt. The emergency account Robert and I had built over years, the one meant for moments no insurance could cover, drained without a word. And as I stared at those red numbers, one thought rose above the rest. This wasn't just about the money. It was about a boundary crossed so quietly, I hadn't even felt it give way. The moment the front door closed behind Daniel and Olivia, the apartment took on a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the stillness I cherished on early mornings, or the hush that came after a long day. This was sharper, more deliberate, like the air had been cleared of any pretense. Their voices faded down the hallway, Olivia's perfume lingering faintly sweet, but almost cloying. I waited until the elevator doors clanked shut before moving from my chair. In the second bedroom, the one they liked to call the office, but had turned into extra storage, I pulled open the closet doors. Stacks of folded blankets and coats filled most of the shelves, but wedged in the back was a small black fireproof box. I carried it to the kitchen, placing it gently on the counter. The metal felt colder than I remembered, the latch stiff from years without use. Inside each folder sat exactly where I had left it: old bank records, insurance documents, and the login information for the emergency account. One envelope caught my eye. It bore my full name and social security number in clean typed print. Inside was a copy of an account access form, my signature scanned at the bottom. Only, it wasn't quite mine. The tail of the E in Lewis curved in a way I hadn't written in years. I set the paper aside and reached for my laptop, the older one Daniel had insisted I replace. The screen flickered once before settling, the familiar hum filling the room. I logged into the account's activity history. The transactions for the Maldives trip stood out immediately: large payments to a luxury travel agency complete with airfare and a private villa. But it wasn't just the amount. The method was unusual, routed through a type of internal authorization I'd only ever seen in system training. It was a process Daniel had once watched me use late at night years ago, back when he was curious about my work. My hands stayed steady as I took out a spiral notebook. I began listing each transfer, the amounts, the dates, and the confirmation codes. I wrote the travel agency's name in block letters at the top of the page, followed by a single line beneath it. He knew exactly what he was doing. The light above the sink flickered once before holding steady, pulling my attention back to the present. I returned the papers to the box, slid it back into the closet, and closed the door without a sound. Tea seemed like the next logical step. Water to the right temperature, 2 minutes steeping, the same way I'd done for years. As I cupped the mug between my hands, the hum of passing traffic outside reminded me of the runway views I'd watched from my window for so long. The steady movement of planes always made sense: departure, flight, arrival. People, though, didn't seem to follow such predictable paths. The next morning, I sent a short, straightforward email to Monica Green. She pointed out a sequence code that proved it had been submitted remotely, not signed in person. She flipped to the transfer logs and noted how each withdrawal had been timed between 2 and 4 in the morning, spread out over 3 weeks, just below the threshold that might trigger an alert. I watched her expression change as she pieced together the pattern. When she finished, she folded her hands over the papers and looked at me directly. "What do you want to do next?" Her voice carried no judgment, only clarity. I told her my priority was to document everything, to have a record that would hold up if I needed to take legal action. I wasn't interested in a rushed confrontation. I wanted facts that couldn't be dismissed. She nodded once and pulled a legal pad from her bag. Together we mapped out a chain of custody for the evidence: every transfer, every login, every timestamp. We cross-referenced the bank records with Olivia's public posts from the same days, marking overlaps between their travel and the account activity. At one point, Monica asked if I still had the old laptop Daniel had configured years ago. When I told her I did, she smiled slightly, noting it could help pinpoint the first breach. After nearly an hour, Monica slid a sheet of paper toward me. It outlined a backup protocol, a secure messaging app recommendation, and contact information for a local attorney who specialized in elder financial exploitation. I folded the page carefully and placed it in my purse. As we stepped outside, the clouds had begun to gather. The air carried the metallic scent that always comes just before rain. That evening, back at the apartment, I spread the documents across my desk once more. I read each one again, not because I had forgotten, but to make sure I understood every detail. The clock on the wall ticked softly as I wrote one last note at the bottom of the page in my notebook. He learned this from me. Now I will teach him something else. By the time Daniel and Olivia returned from the Maldives, I was ready. I heard the key turn just after 9 on a Wednesday night. Their voices carried that particular tone of travelers who had enjoyed themselves without worrying about the cost. I stayed in my room listening as they unpacked. Olivia described the food and the resort pool, while Daniel muttered about the time change. Eventually, Olivia asked if I had checked the mail. She mentioned a confirmation for a photo shoot package and reminded Daniel to transfer the final balance. I noted the time in my notebook, 9:41 p.m., and closed it. The next morning, I walked to the print shop near the plaza and made 3 copies of the file, one for myself, one for Monica, and one for Daniel. I placed his in a sealed envelope and left it on his desk without a note. By evening, the envelope was still there. It wasn't until after 7 that the apartment grew still in a way that told me he had opened it. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, the papers in his hand. When I passed him on my way to the kitchen, I told him I would be transferring the lease to a new tenant and moving to a smaller place near the lake. I added that I had consulted legal counsel and that the documents proved unauthorized access. I made it clear I hadn't filed charges yet, but would if anything else disappeared. He said nothing, just stood holding the envelope. I walked back to my room, closing the door softly behind me. For the first time in months, the apartment felt honest, even if it wasn't peaceful yet. Daniel avoided speaking to me over the next few days. If he was home, he stayed in the bedroom or left the apartment entirely. Olivia, on the other hand, tried to carry on, as if nothing had shifted. She filled the kitchen with the scent of herbal teas and posted short videos about emotional balance while wearing a silk robe. I noticed her posting less often, though, and the comments under her content had thinned. A few people asked about their trip, 1 or 2 hinting at trouble. She ignored them the same way she seemed determined to ignore the change in Daniel. One afternoon, I heard raised voices through their closed bedroom door. Olivia's tone was sharp, asking why he hadn't sent files to a sponsor or answered messages from their agent. Daniel replied in a low voice I couldn't make out. The silence that followed pressed against the walls. I stayed in my room, letting their conversation end without my presence in it. That evening, I called the owner of a small apartment complex near the lake. The second-floor unit had clean wood floors, an east-facing window, and just enough space for one. I set a move-in date for the 1st of the month. When I returned from signing the paperwork, Daniel was at the dining table. The folder I'd left him days earlier was open, its contents arranged neatly as though he'd been studying them. Without looking up, he asked, "Do you hate me?" I didn't answer. I walked to the cabinet, poured myself a glass of water, and went to my room. Later that night, I heard the sound of drawers opening and closing, the soft shuffle of belongings being moved. By morning, a note sat on the counter. Daniel had gone to stay with a friend for a while. No mention of when he'd return. Olivia didn't bring it up once. She went on filming and cooking, but there was less light in her voice, even under the bright ring light she used for her videos. I began packing my own things in slow, steady steps. I sorted through boxes I had avoided for years, Robert's old flight logs, letters from colleagues, half-filled journals. Each item was weighed for its place in my next home. Some I kept, some I let go. With each box I sealed, the apartment felt less like mine and more like a place I was passing through. 2 days before my move, Olivia knocked on my bedroom door. Her voice was softer than usual, almost tentative. She asked if I had a minute. I opened the door and stepped back to let her in. She wore a pale robe and held her phone loosely in one hand, the other twisting the edge of her sleeve. Her expression was unguarded, the smoothness she usually kept for her audience replaced with something more tired. She glanced around the room before speaking. "Daniel told me about the folder," she said quietly. "Not everything, but enough." I stayed seated on the edge of the bed and waited. She told me she didn't know the details of what he had done and didn't want to. But she admitted she'd noticed how money seemed to appear when they needed it, how things were always covered without questions. She said she had convinced herself I was simply generous, that I wanted to help them without boundaries. Then she hesitated, as though weighing her next words. "The Maldives trip. It was part of a brand partnership," she explained. They had used the trip to create content for a campaign that had already paid them in advance. The payment had gone directly into their joint account 2 days ago. She looked at me as if expecting a shift in my expression. I told her I didn't want the money, not a cent of it. She blinked, her brow tightening slightly, and asked if I would consider staying. I stood, keeping my voice even. "This isn't about money, or where I live," I said. "It's about peace. And I'm reclaiming mine." She didn't argue. She only let her eyes linger on the packed suitcase in the corner before leaving the room. That night, I finished boxing the last of my belongings. A few well-worn maps, a single framed photo of Robert and me at Glacier Bay, and the notebooks I'd decided to keep. I labeled each box, clearly stacked them neatly by the door, and sat in the empty space to listen to the quiet. This time, it wasn't the tense stillness of unspoken words. It was the kind of quiet that comes when something is finished. The following morning, I placed a small envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside was the apartment key, a list of forwarding addresses, and a note that read, "No passwords, no access, no return." I locked the door one final time and walked away. My hands empty, my steps steady. The lake apartment greeted me with the soft hum of stillness. No overlapping voices from another room, no footsteps outside my door, just the gentle movement of water beyond the window. I unpacked slowly, placing the kettle where I could reach it easily, lining a single shelf with the books I had kept, and setting Robert's photo near the window so the morning light would find him. There was no rush now, only rhythm, the kind that comes when you are no longer bracing for the next disruption. The lake apartment settled around me quickly. By the second week, I knew how the light fell through the east window each morning, where the boards in the hallway creaked, and how the wind carried across the water on colder days. The quiet wasn't empty. It had its own rhythm. Some mornings I brewed coffee and let it sit on the table while I read, not needing to watch the clock. Other days, I walked the shoreline path, learning the bends and the benches by heart. One Sunday evening, Monica visited. She stepped in with a cloth-lined basket holding warm cornbread and a small jar of elderberry syrup she'd made herself. We sat at the table with the lake behind us, and she slid a sealed envelope across the wood. "Everything we talked about," she said. Inside was a complete report, every unauthorized transfer, each signature discrepancy, a timeline of access, and supporting documents in order. At the bottom was a prepared note ready for legal submission if I chose to use it. I placed the envelope in the top drawer beside my tea canister. Before she left, Monica mentioned something she hadn't included in the written report. Daniel had tried to reverse 2 of the transfers the week before. Both attempts had been blocked by the bank's fraud protection, but they were logged. I sat with that information long after she drove away. It didn't change what had happened, but it confirmed that he had started to feel the edges of what he'd done. The next few weeks passed without a call or message from him. Olivia's name appeared less often in the places where her brand was usually visible. I didn't seek out updates, but here and there a mutual acquaintance would mention she'd been quieter online. I spent my mornings on small, steady routines, watering the rosemary plant on the windowsill, keeping my desk clear, and setting aside time for a short walk. The days felt full enough without interruption. One gray Tuesday afternoon, a letter arrived in an envelope addressed in Daniel's handwriting. I left it on the table for a while before opening it, wanting to read with a level head. Inside, he admitted to forging my name, moving the money, and convincing himself it wasn't theft at first. He wrote that Olivia didn't know the full scope, and that he had kept her at a distance even when she asked. There was no request for forgiveness, only an acknowledgement that he now understood why I had walked away. I folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer as Monica's report. That evening, Monica called. She'd spoken quietly with a contact at the firm where Daniel used to work. He had stepped away from several freelance accounts without announcement. No headlines, no explanations, just a gradual withdrawal from the circles he'd once moved in easily. Her voice was even as she said, "Some people only learn from loss when there's nothing left to explain it away." The next morning, I packed a small bag and drove north along the coast. I stayed at a modest guest house where the windows opened to sea cliffs, and the air carried the scent of salt. My days were unhurried, watching seabirds dive in the early light, walking along narrow trails in the afternoon, writing in a notebook I didn't plan to share with anyone. The space between each day felt wide enough to breathe in. When autumn settled in, I returned to the apartment by the lake. The trees along the shore had dropped most of their leaves, leaving bare branches against a pale sky. The rooms smelled faintly of cedar and the last coffee I'd brewed before leaving. I put my bag down and stood for a moment in the stillness. The folder in the drawer remained where I'd left it. I didn't need to open it. The facts were already clear, and I no longer felt the need to revisit them. I opened the window just enough to let in the crisp air. Wrapping a blanket around my shoulders, I sat at the table and watched the water move under the shifting wind. It was quiet, but not in a way that demanded filling. It was the kind of quiet that simply let things be. That evening, as I set the kettle to boil, I realized the apartment no longer felt like a temporary stop. It felt like the place where the next chapter would begin. 2 weeks after I'd settled back into the lake apartment, a flyer slipped from the grocery bag as I unpacked my things. It was for a local skills-sharing group that met twice a month in the library annex. Seniors were teaching each other everything from budgeting to navigating online insurance forms. The number at the bottom led to a woman named Carol, whose warm, steady voice made it easy to say yes. She told me their next meeting was in 3 days, and that newcomers were always welcome. When I arrived, a round table had already filled with 5 women and 1 man. They greeted me without fuss, making room between stacks of printed handouts and mugs of coffee. The conversation moved easily, questions about Medicare forms, frustrations with online banking, even quiet mentions of children pressing for power of attorney too soon. When it was my turn, I spoke about what it meant to love someone who had crossed a line and how hard it could be to set boundaries after years of letting things slide. No one interrupted, and when I finished, one woman simply nodded and said, "You kept your dignity." That's no small thing. After the meeting, I stayed to help stack chairs. Will the quiet man at the table carried a box of leftover forms to my car? On the walk, he asked if I'd be back for the next session. I told him I would. Driving home, I noticed how different the air felt when you left a place carrying less than you brought in. The winter months passed with a calm I hadn't known in years. Snow arrived late, dusting the rooftops and melting quickly along the lake's edge. I kept to my routines: morning walks when the paths were clear, afternoons spent reading or writing notes I didn't need to send. Daniel hadn't called, and I no longer checked my phone expecting him to. One afternoon, Carol asked if I would lead a short segment at the February meeting. The topic was financial boundaries between parents and adult children. I agreed, keeping my preparation simple. I wanted the advice to be practical, clear steps anyone could take without turning it into a lecture. The day of the meeting, I stood at the small podium, the faces in the front row attentive. Halfway through, I set my notes aside and spoke from memory about trust, about the importance of protecting what you've built, and how generosity without boundaries could be mistaken for permission. When I finished, there was a short silence before a woman in the second row said softly, "Thank you." It was enough. That night, I walked home under a sky scattered with stars, the snow on the ground soft under my boots. The apartment windows glowed warm as I approached, and when I stepped inside, the scent of tea leaves met me. I filled the kettle, sat by the window, and watched the lake's surface shift under the wind. It wasn't spring yet, but the ice at the edges was starting to give way. A late February wind pushed across the lake, scattering small ripples against the shore. From my window, I watched the ice retreat another few feet from the rocks, leaving behind dark water that caught the fading light. Inside, the apartment was warm, the kettle humming low on the counter. I had just returned from the library group, my folder still in the tote by the door. That evening, I pulled out Monica's report again. The pages were as neat as the day she'd given them to me, each section marked with her steady handwriting. I read through the timeline slowly, making sure I still understood how the transfers had been spaced. The evidence was airtight. In the back pocket of the folder sat the prepared statement for legal submission, unsigned but ready. I closed the cover and slid it back into the drawer. A week later, I stopped by the co-op for groceries. On the way home, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail, only listening once I had unpacked the bags. Daniel's voice came through quieter than I remembered. He said he was in town, asked if we could meet somewhere public to talk. There was no mention of Olivia. I let the message sit until morning before deciding. We met at a small cafe 2 blocks from the water. Daniel was already there, seated at a corner table with a mug in front of him untouched. He looked tired, his shoulders drawn inward. "Thank you for coming," he said. I nodded and waited. He spoke slowly, admitting he had tried to put the money back, but the bank blocked it. He didn't make excuses this time. "I can't undo it," he said, "but I wanted you to hear me say I was wrong." I told him I appreciated the clarity. Then I explained that I had kept the documentation, that it was in safe hands, and that I would not hesitate to use it if anything else happened. His gaze dropped to the table. There was no argument, no attempt to bargain. We sat in silence for a while before I stood to leave. He didn't follow me out. Back at the apartment, I filled the kettle and set it to boil. The air felt heavier than it had in months, though not in the way it once had. It was simply the weight of finality settling into place. I poured the tea, letting the steam rise before taking a sip. Outside, the lake shifted under a thin layer of evening mist. 2 days later, Carol called from the library group. A local community center was hosting a panel on financial safety for older adults, and they needed one more speaker. She thought my experience might add something to the discussion. I agreed, asking only that the format stay focused on practical steps. She assured me it would. The panel was scheduled for the following Saturday. I arrived early, taking a seat at the end of the table. The other speakers included a retired credit union manager and a lawyer who specialized in estate planning. We spoke to a small crowd, each of us sharing ways to protect assets and recognize early signs of financial manipulation. When it was my turn, I stayed with the facts. Never names, never personal details, just the steps I had taken and the importance of documentation. Afterward, a man from the audience approached. He said his sister had been through something similar, though with a neighbor instead of family. He thanked me for speaking plainly about boundaries, and we shook hands before parting. Driving home, I thought about how much lighter a story can feel when you carry only the parts that might help someone else. That night, I left the curtains open. From my chair, I could see the moon reflected in the open water. The ice was nearly gone now, and the edges of the lake looked softer, ready for spring. Somewhere in the stillness, I knew another shift was coming. The morning after the panel, I woke to a thin fog drifting over the lake. It blurred the opposite shore, softening the outlines of the trees. I made tea and sat at the table, letting the warmth settle into my hands. The quiet felt different now, still steady, but carrying the sense that something had shifted for good. Later that week, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. There was no return address, but I recognized the handwriting. Daniel's note was brief. He thanked me for meeting him at the cafe and said he had decided to close the joint account he shared with Olivia. He didn't explain why, only that it was the right thing to do. That afternoon, Monica stopped by on her way back from a meeting downtown. She set her bag on the counter and leaned against it, her expression unreadable. "I heard from a contact," she said. Daniel had turned down 2 consulting offers, both from companies tied to his old firm. She wasn't sure if it was by choice or necessity, but it was another step away from the work that had once given him easy access to other people's systems. I nodded, not asking for more. The next library group meeting felt lighter than the last. Will brought a thermos of coffee, and Carol handed out a list of new workshop ideas. When the discussion turned to upcoming sessions, someone suggested a class on online privacy. A few heads turned toward me, and I agreed to lead it. The plan was to make it hands-on, simple steps, printed guides, and time for questions. In the days leading up to the workshop, I found myself clearing space on my desk. I organized the printed materials into neat stacks and checked each example on my laptop to be sure it matched the handouts. The act of preparing felt steadying the way methodical work always had for me. On the day of the session, the annex room was nearly full. People brought their own devices, and the sound of typing filled the air as we moved through the exercises. We covered how to check account permissions, how to recognize a secure connection, and how to spot suspicious requests. By the end, a few participants lingered to ask more specific questions. One woman clasped my hand and said she finally understood how to take control of her own accounts. When I left the library, the fog from the morning had lifted. The lake shimmered under a pale winter sun, and the air felt sharper. Walking home, I thought about how far things had come from that first morning when I overheard Olivia's voice in my living room. That night, I pulled the curtain back and watched the last of the ice drift toward the far bank. There was no telling what Daniel's next steps would be or if Olivia would ever reach out, but for the first time in a long while, the uncertainty didn't feel like a threat. It was simply part of what came next. Spring came on slowly around the lake, the last ice slipping away from the rocks and the reeds standing a little taller each morning. I kept the curtains open more, letting the light reach the table where my kettle notebook and Robert's photo shared the same square of sun. Monica stopped by one afternoon with fresh copies of the report, not because anything had changed, but because she liked things current. We had tea and said very little. When she left, I placed the folder back in the drawer where it belonged, close enough to reach, quiet enough to forget most days. At the library, Carol added new workshops to the calendar, and I took 2 of them. The first was a follow-up on online safety with printed step-by-step guides. The second, a small session on setting financial boundaries without turning family into adversaries. Will helped carry chairs, humming under his breath, as we stacked them against the wall. People lingered after each class, not for drama, but for small practical questions, which alerts to enable how to keep copies of important papers, when to say, "Let me think about that." I left each evening with fewer handouts and a steady feeling I recognized from years of checklists and flight logs. A plain envelope arrived in early May with Daniel's handwriting on the front. The note inside was short. He had closed accounts, ended a few contracts, and found work far from systems that weren't his to touch. He didn't ask to meet. He wished me well and signed with his full name. I set the letter beside the first one, then slid both into the drawer with the report. It felt right to keep all 3 things together: the truth of what happened, the proof of it, and the space I chose afterward. I walked more once the weather warmed. The path around the east side of the lake opened to small clearings where children ran, where couples shared quiet benches, where geese cut the water like small boats. I learned the faces of the morning crowd, the nods and brief hellos, the easy rhythm that comes when no one needs anything from you. Home felt lighter when I returned to it. I cooked simple meals, watered the rosemary, and kept the place tidy without effort. Some nights, I pulled out the old maps Robert loved, tracing routes we never took but used to talk about. Justice didn't arrive with a gavel or a headline. It settled in piece by piece, the halted transfers, the closed doors, the end of access that was never earned. It lived in my new routines, in the certainty that every key in my bowl was mine. It sounded like a room that stayed quiet because the people in it were kind, not because anyone was afraid to speak. It looked like a life that fit again. One Saturday, the community center hosted a larger gathering. I spoke last, keeping my words simple. Document what matters. Share less than you keep. Give help without giving yourself away. A woman near the aisle wiped her eyes and said thank you into her hands. We stacked chairs afterward, and I carried a box of leftover forms out to the car with Will. The sky was the clear blue you only get after a long season of gray. That night, I sat by the open window with a cup of tea and let the air move through the room. I thought about the early morning when everything shifted and the long days that followed. I thought about boundaries that hold even when no one is watching, and the small, steady ways a person can return to herself. In the end, I didn't need to win anything back. I needed to remember what was already mine. My name, my peace, my say. If any part of this story met you where you live, take a breath and think about the lines that keep you whole. Tell me what you're holding on to these days, and if the quiet feels good where you are, I'm glad you're here. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're welcome to stay.